Hello friends, you all seem to really enjoy the vlog style of one of my last videos. So, я только что сварил кофе, а теперь собираюсь почитать свою книгу. And why am I speaking Russian? Well, because I thought it would be fun to bring you along and witness the pitiful and miserable life of someone studying Russian, yet rewarding life as well. And also specifically talk about this book and talk about this man right here. Alexei Bishkov, better known as Maxim Gorky. This has been a perfect complement to or supplement to the history book that I was reading in the last vlog and that I'm still reading and will probably be reading for the next few weeks, The House of Government, sitting right beside me. And so along with learning about Russian history and specifically the Russian Revolution, both the decades leading up to the revolution itself, and the decades after, a central figure has been Maxim Gorky. He's mentioned not only as a prominent voice within the literary committees that were emerging within the Bolsheviks post-revolution, but just a central figure overall, a prominent voice, a voice that carries weight and reputation across multiple decades in the early 20th century. And I bought this book back in earlier last month, I believe it was, and I mentioned in my book haul. This is called My Childhood, or in Russian, Детство. And it's an autobiographical piece. It's one of 3 autobiographical works that Gorky published. This one, I think, was in like the 1913, 1940 time when this book first came out. And this one covers his childhood. The other one covers, I think, his like adolescence and early adulthood. And the other one is universities. And what interests me most about Maxim Gorky is that despite his celebrity, his works aren't that widely read, at least here in America. And I think part of that is because he doesn't have that front-facing magnum opus. He doesn't have a War and Peace. He doesn't have the Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment, or even like a Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, like something that's just leaping off his bibliography that would be constantly in print. But as far as I know there's a Penguin edition of this exact book, but his works aren't regularly in print. They're really hard to find, at least in my experience, at most bookstores, and I wonder why that is. Because he is such a central figure. He's in photos with Chekhov and Tolstoy, and he's deeply embedded, not just in the literary community, but in Russian culture and history overall. So all that to say, that's who I'm going to be exploring and talking about as I read this book, and specifically a few key notes that I think are really fascinating. First off, this edition I have is so neat. Like I mentioned, I bought it at this rare bookstore in Knoxville called Addison's. And I saw it on the shelf beside the 3rd book in the trilogy. And I felt bad doing it, but I broke up the set. It was missing the middle book anyway, so I figured it wasn't immoral to buy one of the books but not the other. I didn't know how many books I would be buying on that trip and take home. And lo and behold, I start reading this, really love it so far, and I regretted not getting the other book. So I ended up calling the bookstore, and they still had it. I bought it. It'll be here next week. So I'm starting to evolve a bit as not just as a reader, but as a book collector. I wouldn't say I'm quite becoming this antiquarian reader and really trying to develop these antique and rare and collectible books, but I am starting to have a bit more precision and intention with which editions I buy, what kind of books I buy, how they're going to look on the shelf, and just have a little bit of that collector personality to me. So I wonder, are you guys like that? Why are you that way, or why do you not care about if it's a first edition or something rare like that? But specifically, this edition is quite neat for 2 reasons that come to mind. One is that it was actually published in Moscow by the Foreign Languages Publishing House. So it even says here on one of the early pages, printed in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So just to me, that's pretty neat to know that this book was in Moscow at one point, and now it's in my hands maybe 50, 70 years later here in Colorado. So that's kind of neat. And the other thing is that it is translated by this woman named Margaret Vetlin. And at first, I figured, oh, maybe she's German, or, you don't really think too much about the translators. And then I looked her up, And this may not be that fascinating to you, but it's super fascinating to me. She's an American woman that traveled to the USSR in 1934 under a tourist visa. She started working there, teaching, I believe. She met her husband, a Soviet citizen, and got married. And soon after they were married, Stalin enacted this decree that said, essentially, if you're a foreigner, you either have to leave the country or become a Soviet citizen. So with this pressure, not wanting to leave her family or new husband, she becomes a Soviet citizen and starts working at the Foreign Languages Publishing House. And quickly after working there, she is forced by the Soviet secret police to be an informant. And so she has to start snitching and keeping notes and tabs on her neighbors, family, acquaintances, workers, all of that. And as she's doing this for years, certain people start disappearing. And so you just wonder, like, the guilt and the fear that must be living in her mind. Throughout World War II, she works as a reporter for Moscow radio. And then after the war, she starts working on Gorky translation. So that's why I think this is probably around the 50s, early 50s, late 40s, when she started working on these translations of Gorky. And it's only later, obviously, after Stalin's passed away and the USSR eventually collapses, that she no longer has to work for the secret police. But very brave woman, very fascinating story. She ended up writing a book, I believe, called Russian Road, covering her experience, her observations living in the Soviet Union. So, long intro to this video, but the coffee's fired up and ready. I'm about 60 pages into this book and really loving the autobiography so far. It's my first, everything's going to be a first. I'm a new reader. I've explained this before. It's going to be my first jump into any kind of autobiographical work, at least in a direct sense. I know The Bell Jar is pretty autofiction. I'm sure there's some other works that I've read that are. But enjoying it so far. So without further ado, I'm bringing you along today, possibly in a couple days, and bring you along for me studying Russian. You can see what it's like to struggle and cry tears trying to conjugate Russian verbs and handle all the grammatical cases. And also we'll be chatting about Maxim Gorky, one of the super important yet semi-forgotten names in Russian literary history. All right, I just finished reading for today, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what this book has been like. It is not an easy read. It is a very sad book because he had a very sad childhood. It was bleak, it was abysmal, it was full of misfortune and abuse and death. And in the story, I mean, you're thrust right into the fire as soon as the story begins. As a young child, the book begins with the death of his father. And he's essentially orphaned. His mother is kind of in and out of the picture, but he's primarily raised by his grandmother. And the reason I'm really enjoying this book so far is because I think it really provides a glimpse into what the at least common life was like for Russians of this time period. Of course, you can't take one experience and cast it upon a whole nation of peoples, but it at least, and this is how memoirs and autobiographies work well, is it allows you to peer into a particular life at such a microscopic level and see those experiences and let them develop. And I think it makes it such a valuable supplement read to the historical context that I'm getting in the House of Government. But to pull out a quote here and give you a little bit of a taste of the work so far, he says, quote, "But the truth is beyond all commiseration, and it is not about myself I am writing, but about the stifling and horrifying surroundings in which the ordinary Russian lived and still lives." And later on, after his, like I mentioned, his father has passed away, he's introduced into this more abusive household, and he's being beaten by his grandfather. And he gets beaten for the first time. He'd never had this happen before. His mother and father had never put hands on him or treated him this way. And he's beaten to a state of unconsciousness. And he's ill for a few days after it, and he comes to, and he says, quote, "During that time, I seemed to suddenly grow older and develop a new quality, that of being deeply concerned about all people. It was as though the skin had been torn off my heart, making it unbearably sensitive to every injury, my own or another's." So you kind of get an idea of how just horrid and abusive this childhood had been, how traumatic it was on his life. And unfortunately, it didn't get much better for Gorky. Of course, he made a massive name for himself, and he's a bit of a literary hero of Soviet literature, especially in the early days. But it ties to his name, Maxim Gorky. Where does that come from? Gorky in Russian means bitter. And that makes sense. He had a very bitter life, a very bitter childhood. And his life was still filled with a lot of death. His son passed away just a few years before he did. His wife passed away in 1903. And the name Maxim, as well to mention, comes from his father's name, comes from his infant brother who died as an infant. And also it's his patronymic, or Achetstva, is Maximovich. So Alexei Maximovich Peshkov. So that's where the name Maxim Gorky comes from, to give you a little bit of fun facts about a little bit of trivia. And also he was invited by Mark Twain and other American writers to visit New York City. So he spent a little bit of time in New York, almost visited the White House, invited by Theodore Roosevelt before that was rescinded. And again, this just very colorful, interesting character, and one that I don't feel like has gotten nearly his popularity in Russian and in Russian history, and how often he's mentioned versus how much he's read, at least in America. There's a disparity is basically what I'm getting at, that I'm curious to see why that is. I suppose it's because he doesn't have that massively popular and successful work, but maybe there's another reason. But reading these obscure Russian works like the 12 Chairs, like Red Cavalry, these different early Soviet works, has been really fascinating to me. So I'm going to have to keep an eye out for more of those works and see where I can find them in these used bookstores. Supposedly, this deranged man in Boston who frequents this historic bookstore seemingly every day, supposedly he's keeping an eye out for me, and gonna try and grab some of these more obscure, rare Russian or Soviet works for me. But we'll see if he pulls through. But that's it for now. I'm done reading this for today. I'll pick it up probably this evening, but I think later this evening I'll bring you along for studying Russian, and you can laugh at my misery. So we'll see.
Я нашел вам несколько вариантов по вашему запросу. Сегодня можно посмотреть одну квартиру.
Здравствуйте, это Руслан, риэлтор из агентства недвижимости «Ваш дом». Я нашел вам несколько вопросов. Ой, извините, Руслан, у меня нет под рукой ручки и бумаги. Slowly but surely, my Russian is getting just a little bit better day by day. I've been studying it for 7 months now, and I've definitely made a lot of progress, but it is so humbling to realize how far I have to go, even to read the most simple poem in Russian, which leads me to my next point, which is I'm at this stage now where I'm testing out a lot of different methods of learning and instilling what I learn, but also learning new vocab along the way, because as you saw, I use this service called Rocket Russian. Other people use Duolingo, or I think it's called Pimsleur and Rosetta Stone, all these different apps, right? And these are a great place to start. But as the memes on Instagram would show you, these apps do not prepare you for real conversations. They don't prepare you to actually be fluent in the language. They're a good foundation, and they're fun ways, and they're interactive, and they help you practice your reading, your speaking, your writing, all of that. But they're limited. You actually have to go out in the world, believe it or not, and speak to natives and force your mind to start thinking in said language and speaking in that language. And if I'm completely honest, I don't do that enough. I do a lot of texting different natives on different apps, it's wonderful that many natives, especially Russians, are very willing to help Americans or to help people who are taking on the drudgery that is learning a new language. But for the most part, I've been using just the small subset of vocab I have, and it's quite limiting. So I've been trying different methods for expanding my vocab so that, and using it outside of these small study sessions so that the vocab becomes more instilled in my brain, and I can use it, at hand. I can have the vocabulary at hand rather than freezing for a moment or pulling out my Translator app. And two methods I've been using recently that I want to share with you all. One is I recently bought this bilingual book about a month ago, not expecting to be able to read it now, but I thought it would be a fun studying tool to try and work through 1 or 2 pages at a time. I have the Russian on one side and then the English on another, of course. And this is actually kind of neat because it has 12 different stories, I think from 12 different Russian authors. Dostoevsky, Gogol, Turgenev, Leskov, Chekhov, Pushkin. It's got a lot in here, which is kind of neat to just read them in general. But let me tell you, I tried to read one page. One page, I sound like a babbling toddler when I try to read this stuff. At the end of this, I will give an honest. I'm not even trying to like set up or pose to make it funny. I will read in a moment a few sentences. Some words you'll be able to tell I know how to pronounce them or say them, because over time, I will say one thing is my mouth has gotten used to making these noises that aren't common in English. Здравствуйте, or some of these long words, самостоятельно, достопримечательности. These different things, like my mouth and tongue have gotten used to flowing in this way. But I still hit words that I just have no clue and I like freeze up on. Or there's still some letters that I naturally think are these English letters. So that's one method I've been doing, and it's crushing because I try and read one page and it takes me like 20 minutes and I'm grasping at my translator, and it just makes me realize I am years away, unfortunately, from really reading the works that I want to. But the other method I just started last night, so maybe I'll show it to you tomorrow if I end up filming some more of my studying. But I want to start dissecting poems, short poems. So I got one from Pushkin called "I Love You," or "Ya lubil," or "Ya vas lubil." I loved you. Yeah, "Ya vas lubil." And then I downloaded one from Anna Amatomov. I think that's the name, Anna Amatomov. I'll put it on the screen. If I'm completely butchering it, forgive me. I haven't read a ton of her work, so the name isn't coming natural to me. But I downloaded some of her poems that I can get for free online. And I just want to start dissecting them along with song lyrics. I have a big playlist on Spotify of songs, and just start grabbing those lyrics, start dissecting. And obviously I can pump them in a translator, but starting to think through not just the words that I'm learning and what they mean, but what case are they in? Are they plural? Are they masculine, feminine? Because these things are crucial, not just for Russian, but for other languages that are gendered as well, specifically like Spanish comes to mind. So all that to say, I'm working hard at this. This may not be too fascinating, but it does pertain to Gorky and some of this Russian that I'm reading. So for those of you that are studying a language yourself or are bilingual, mass respect to you. Staying strong. То не почитает их извергами, человеч. Хорошо, если удастся ему скоро избавиться от I'm not even going to try that word. You just starting a new one?
Chapter 1.
So one note that I'm realizing while I'm reading this, and perhaps this is true about a lot of autobiographies, is despite that the narrator is obviously Gorky and that he's discussing his childhood, the book is not just about his childhood, obviously. The book is about family. It's about abuse. It's about tradition. It's about the community. It's about religion and the different gods that his grandmother versus his grandfather seems to worship. It's about so much more that you get through the narrative, the anecdotes, and the stories. And that's what I think really carries this book, is the different anecdotes or characters or events that happen. Yes, they're specific to Gorky's childhood, but in a way they're universal. Even in today's world, certain people and their personalities and their reactions to things. So there's a lot to draw from each of these different moments that are happening in his life that he's describing. So enjoying it so far. I'm going to read another 10 or so pages for today, and I think it'll take me another few days to finish, but I'm going to keep reading. Alright, it has been a few days. As you saw yesterday, I went and got coffee with my wife, read a bit more, and we're almost done with this book. I got maybe about 80 pages left, so I'm going to try and finish today. Work is absolutely crazy, so my reading has been a bit lower than I would like it to be, but I'm leaving for a trip to the Grand Tetons with a close friend of mine who lives up in Montana, spending a few days there next week. So cramming work, trying to make sure I got a Substack ready to go, trying to make sure this video gets up in time, and to finish this video I need to finish this book. And despite it looking like I'm in the same exact spot, and for all you know it's the same exact day, the only thing to add some veracity to the claim that it's a different day is that it's quite gloomy. It's a very gloomy day, and here in Colorado it's sunny like 95% of the time, but when it is gloomy, it feels like it's 3 p.m. all day, just that gray overcast feeling. But it kind of makes for decent reading weather. So anywho, got the coffee fired up, got my my reading buddies are off camera, but my beautiful dogs are here with me. So ready to dig more into Детство, the childhood of Mr. Maxim Gorky. You know, one thing I was thinking about yesterday when I was reading this book was that surely very distinct things happen in his life that are particular to him, to the time period. He'll have some kind of atrocity or misfortune happen that grants him the opportunity to overcome it or rise up. And that's what makes for interesting stories, memoirs, autobiographies, all of that, right? But at the same time, I think a lot of what makes a great autobiographical work, whether it contains that level of natural rising action, climax, and falling action and resolution, but they still have to have the elocution of an author and that artistic quality of a writer. You can't just be putting what literally happens on paper and just living off the events themselves, but they still have to be spun a certain way and told in a certain manner. And it makes me think about the other autobiographical works where something that isn't overly interesting or exciting fails to happen, and yet it's still a huge success, like Knausgaard's Min Kamp. Now, I haven't read it yet, and there's proponents that are against this type of writing, but for a lot of people, his writing style works where he's describing these very monotonous, rote tasks, yet the way that he conveys it, the way that he speaks about them, breathes life into the rote, the monotonous, or the ubiquitous, mundane parts of life. And I think in a lot of ways, you'd wonder how can he write 380 pages of a few years of his childhood and make it interesting, especially when there is a lot of repetitive abuse from family members, his mother coming and going, a lot of tales being told to him from his grandmother. And I feel like if I just riffed off what I'm actually reading, it wouldn't sound that interesting to you. But the way that Gorky does it, it's compelling. It draws me in. I'm fascinated. I'm getting something out of it, and I feel like I'm stepping into his world for a brief moment. But I think by using the everyday type of occurrences, they become a bit more familiar, but then they can be elevated or transcend the monotonous or the monotony of it through that language. So I'll leave it there, but got some more reading to do. Now, before I finish the book and give my final thoughts, I want to do a little bit of an audit on my library right now because, as I mentioned, I'm leaving in about 2 days for a trip to the Grand Tetons, and I'm like trying to figure out what's a good book for that trip. I'm not going to finish anything out there, but I want to start a kind of medium-sized novel. And I think I know which one I'm going to choose, but I'll show you the 2 ones I've been teetering on. And I also just want to be honest and show you which books have been collecting dust that some of you might recognize from book hauls like 6 months ago, 8 months ago, So let me bring you over to the shelf real quick and show you what the situation is. Okay, so if you watch my library tour, you'll notice things have been moved around a little bit. So thanks to my wife, who has a beautiful shelf over there. Very, very aesthetic, very colorful. We have my kind of darker, more dull, at least in appearance, books over here. But you'll notice I filled out this Russian section a bit more. So I did add, since then, I got this copy of Dead Souls, which I already have in a Penguin, but I like this Everyman's edition, so I got that recently. Dr. Zhivago added there. I got this nice little presentation. Back here, it's just Fathers and Sons, Turgenev, Crime and Punishment, and then Pushkin's stories back there. Nice little Matrushka doll, another one right there. But you'll notice some other ones I've bought lately that I should be reading soon. So 12 Cheers and Red Cavalry. But the book that I'm thinking about reading soon is Tolstoy's Resurrection. And the only reason I'm not going to bring that on the trip is just because I'm worried about getting too Russianed out, if that makes sense. I'm worried about just drowning myself in too much Russian material between the history, studying the language. I read so many Russian novels in the past 6 months, so I think I kind of am doing this alternating where I'll read a Russian novel or novella or something like that, then a non-Russian, then kind of hop back and forth. But let me show you some other changes on the shelf. And then over here, you will notice I got most of my David Foster Wallace, Gravity's Rainbow, and some other works that it might be heresy to have alongside David Foster Wallace, depending on if you're a fan or not. And then this beautiful folio edition I got of The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner right there. Bunch of Penguin classics. We're working our way down a bunch of these Easton Press or Franklin editions, Harvard Classics, whatever they're called. It's kind of like a mixed bag over there. And then tons of different editions and types of books over here. Now, one book that is really collecting dust lately is Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. I promise I'm going to read that soon. I think it's going to be like a December read that I start and finish in the new year. But we will see. And then most of these I've read. I don't think there's actually any I haven't read over here yet. Just recently finished Wuthering Heights back there. But specifically this corner here is what my wife put together for me. It's a TBR corner. So I have all my shorter books I need to read soon right here. So we got Zola, The Dubliners, some Faulkner, DeLillo, and another New York Review of Books. I have my medium length right here. So I actually recently bought American Psycho. I got a good used copy there. And then, so these are all my medium length books I have right here. Also have Don Quixote up there, which more fits along this last pile, which is all like my big, meaty type of novels back there. The Franzen ones I'm really pushing off, but really these I need to get to probably early next year. Nosgard isn't quite, I'd say, the beefy novel that the other ones are, but it's there. And then some shorter works right here I plan to get to really, really soon. So obviously reading Gorky now. I need to read Yevgeny Onegin. I need to read some of these short stories from Ivan Bunin. I got this copy of Virginia Woolf at Goodwill, actually, for like $1. That's nice. And then Rilke. So it's a bunch of these I'm definitely reading soon. But to get to the point, some of these have been collecting dust, especially Magic Mountain, especially 2666. But the book that I think I'm bringing is The Tin Drum. Let me get this out. All right, just going to stay seated on the floor here. But The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. I bought this back in when I traveled to Wyoming for my 100-mile race. And I bought this and James Joyce Dubliners. And I've just been waiting for, I guess, the right time to read it. I thought I might read a different German novelist first, being Thomas Mann. But I don't know, at around 560 pages, I feel like this is the right length where I can really break ground in it on a flight to Wyoming, or to Montana. I'm flying into Montana. I can really break ground, get like 150 pages in over that flight and that morning. Throughout the trip, sitting by a campfire, crush some more pages, and then coming back. I feel like throughout the trip, I could get a good 300 to 400 pages in, maybe 5, and maybe get closer to finishing this. So I think this is like the right length where I'm not going to finish it and be bookless on the trip. That would be a travesty. But it's also going to be, I think, an interesting read. I haven't read any German novelists yet, plenty of philosophers. So anyway, without wasting too much breath, The Tin Drum is, I think, the book I'm going to be bringing for that trip. All right, I finished my childhood this morning, and before I get my final thoughts, look what came in the mail. Perfect timing. The companion to this book that I didn't buy when I was in town in Knoxville. Let me crack open this package safely and show you what's inside. Typically, bubble mailers make me nervous just because books can get absolutely destroyed by the Postal Service. But I'm hoping, since this is a hardcover and it's got some decent wrapping here, that it is in the same condition that I once saw it. But let's do a little reveal here. There she is. My Universities. I don't know how reflective this is. There you go, that's a little bit better. My Universities. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is the third book in this trilogy of autobiographical works from Maxim Gorky. So I am missing the second one, so I'm gonna have to keep an eye out for that. So if you see it, let me know, because I need to complete this collection and read it. With that in mind though, let me give my final thoughts on my childhood. So this book surprised me. I didn't really know what to expect from it. I just saw it sitting on my shelf for a while. It's a beautiful edition, as I mentioned. And I thought, well, let me pick it up now before it ends up collecting dust. And I thoroughly enjoyed the work. Now, what did I enjoy about it? Because that's a quite vague and bland description of me telling you to read a book. To me, Gorky's depiction of his childhood is the embodiment of the Russian soul. What do I mean by that? I can't fully speak to it, as I am obviously not a Russian native. I don't have extensive understanding and history of Russian culture, the people, the spirit. But if I had to imagine what the Russian spirit of the late 19th century into the 20th century would be, it would be what is contained in this book. It is intense resilience, stubbornness, doggedness, grit, gall to withstand torment and misery and misfortune and poverty and abuse, and at the same time remain optimistic. I think that's the key part of the Russian spirit, as far as I can from the Western world peer into it through history and literature. Is it's not just the resilience and the character strength, the mental toughness to withstand the brutal nature of such a society and a people that has been beaten down through constant war, conflict, and economic strife. But through the plight that the population experiences, they remain optimistic. They believe in a future, whether that's a very idealistic position that Dostoevsky takes in his books, or whether it is a purely religious standpoint, a belief that the last judgment, the greater day, salvation is coming. There is this inability to just give in and give up. The people seem so strong, so resilient, so gritty, the mettle that they show. And I think this book embodies that. It embodies that Russian spirit so much. And you also get the depiction of this duality going on between the grandmother specifically, and the idealism and the positivity she has, even when she's abused by her own husband and she sees her sons live this profligate lifestyle. And there's these other characters too, I'll butcher the names of. One it's called, quote, "That's fine," is what he kind of goes by, or at least what Gorky calls him, because of how he would always respond. But there are these different characters and friends that Gorky would befriend in his childhood that had this optimism, that had this positivity, that had this openness, and kind of progressive type of mentality towards society. And then the grandfather is this just a-hole of a character. He's abusive emotionally, physically. He is kind of self-defeating in a lot of ways, and that very much represents the old Russia, or at least the worst side of the Russian character or spirit. Is just this willingness to be sensual and give in to gambling and money and violence. And so this book is just beautiful, and I think as much as I'm rambling on, there's a quote in this that struck me so strongly that I need to recite it to you. I read it to my wife after I read it, so let me find it real quick. I think it's on page 274. Here it is. Tell me that this quote doesn't just draw you into the book and give you a reverence for the Russian people and their spirit. Quote, "Long afterwards, I came to understand that Russians, as a result of the poverty and dullness of their lives, sought diversion and grief, playing it up like children, and rarely feeling ashamed of their misfortunes. When life is monotonous, even grief is a welcome event. Even a fire is diversion. A wart is adornment to a vacuous face." And what he's kind of getting at there is this is just after his family, his mother and his grandfather, screaming at each other, cursing at each other. And yet, minutes later, they're having dinner together as if this didn't happen. And this isn't, unique only to the Russian people. Many of us have come from abusive families where this is the case. Screaming parents or conflict within family ties, and then you still, come together at Thanksgiving or Christmas. But the Russian people seem to seek, especially when families are impoverished, people naturally seek diversion, whether it is through self-defeating behavior of gambling or infidelity and these different things that they know are going to damage themselves more. And they seek out this conflict not because it is pleasurable to them, but it's a distraction, or it gives some sense of excitement and diversion from their own misery, from facing the own awful situation that they're in, basically. And there's one more quote I want to read out to you that I think ties this book together, caps it off. This is towards the end of the book, and he's talking about the Russian spirit. Quote, "Our life is amazing not only for the vigorous scum of bestiality with which it is overgrown, but also for the bright and wholesome creative forces gleaming beneath. And the influence of good is growing, giving promise that our people will at last awaken to a life full of beauty and bright humanity." So that's what I'm talking about. This book is full of death in the family, abuse in the family, sensual destruction. The few people that he befriends in his childhood are ripped from him either through death or other factors. And he's humiliated and lonely and isolated throughout much of the book. Yet he still finds this hope for humanity and this positivity and this belief in the ideal. And that's, I think, why I enjoyed this book so much. So, now I have to get to this one. I don't think I will start this book, despite it being a bit shorter. I don't think I will get to it until I find the second book. I'd like to read them in order. I don't think it's mandatory, but I would like to. So I'm going to put this off until I find the second, read that, then get to this one. I will say this one's in much better shape. I don't know if you can tell, the pages are a bit brighter, everything's a bit cleaner. The other one is a little bit on the verge of falling apart on the last 20 pages, so need to be careful with that and potentially get it repaired if it gets any worse. But if any of you have made it this far in the video, perhaps you've skipped to my final thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I really do enjoy this kind of style of video. It's a little bit different for me because I'm not always sure whether you actually care about some of these things, or if I am rambling to a blank wall or an empty camera here. But hopefully it's entertaining, hopefully it's interesting, hopefully it provides a bit of a more nuanced, natural, organic response rather than some kind of carefully crafted, straight to the point type of review. So hopefully you enjoyed laughing at me studying my Russian, because it is a laborsome endeavor, but a rewarding one, as you can see hopefully in this video, some of the things I am able to say or think in Russian. And the book was phenomenal. I definitely plan to read more of Gorky, read more of these tertiary Russian figures because I think they deserve more of the limelight, and hopefully I can be a part of raising them up and giving them some of the shine that they greatly deserve. So that's enough of me speaking. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything I've said in this video. Subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next video.